Hello, welcome. Thanks for joining us. My name is James Hadley, Executive Director of Musical Theatre Network. For purposes of audio description, I'm a white male with a beard, wearing a blue shirt and a green jersey against a sloping sort of attic background. Thank you for joining us today. If you are joining us live, we are in a Zoom call being live streamed to you on YouTube, and you can type in questions for our wonderful funding specialists throughout this call. Just put them into the YouTube chat, prefaced with the word question in capital letters. So do put in your questions at any point, and Emily and myself, will be asking them to the panelists. Today is an event talking about project funding, and usually we have one panel through the whole way through. For the first time, we've got a two-part event today, double for your money. So for the first 45 minutes, we have our specialists from Arts Council England, and for the second half of the conversation, we'll be joined by three other panelists: Neil Marcus, Fiona Mallin-Robinson, and Elizabeth Sills from the PRS Foundation will be joining us from 6:45 onwards. But for the first 45 minutes, we have our wonderful specialists from Arts Council England, who will be introducing themselves in just a moment. I will now pass you over to my co-host, Emily Gray, if she's there. Maybe we're having a little bit of a time lag delay, so it may well be that Emily's on still. So I might hand you over instead to one of our Arts Council England specialists, Nafeesah.
Hi there, my name's Nafeesah. I'm a relationship manager at the Arts Council. For purposes of audio description, I am a South Asian woman. I've got long black hair and I'm wearing red glasses, and I'm in a kitchen with white cabinets behind me, and that's me. I'll pass over to my colleague, Claire.
Hi everyone, so my name is Claire Saddleton. I'm a Senior Relationship Manager for the theatre team in London at the Arts Council. For the purposes of audio description, I'm a white woman in her early 50s with short greying brown hair, wear round glasses, and I've got a couple of ukuleles on the wall behind me. I also have a small dog running around that may bark occasionally, for which I apologise.
No apologies for pet bombing. We love pet bombing here. I should have also added, I may have cats jumping on my shoulder, but hopefully not. Hopefully they won't disturb us. So apologies for Emily. I think we're having some technical difficulties. She was joining us straight after a board meeting very diligently, and I think the technical connection has dropped there. She may well join us a little bit later. Thank you so much, Nafeesah and Claire, for joining us. We know how busy everyone at the Arts Council is. So really grateful to you for joining us to answer some questions about the project funding scheme. Now, I always used to refer to it as Grants for the Arts, because back in my day, that's what it was called. But of course, now it is called the Arts Council's National Lottery Project Grants Programme. And we know there were some changes made in recent months. And so that's one of the reasons we thought it would be great to have a member event just talking about what's new and giving members an opportunity to ask some questions about applying. We know people are always asking questions about how can they make their project applications stronger, what's eligible for funding from the Arts Council and what's not, and also talking about some of the changes with the Arts Council's Let's Create strategy and how that affects project funding and what's a priority in relation to Let's Create. So to begin with, can we ask the two of you to just tell us about what are the sort of headline changes of what's different about applying to the project funding scheme compared to in previous times?
Yes, sure. So what a couple of the key things that have changed is since the end of November, you're now able to apply for up to £30,000. Previously, it was up to £15,000 or over £15,000. Now it's up to 30,000 or over 30,000. With the up to £30,000 applications, you'll get a decision within 8 weeks. So we're hoping that will help people be able to have their activities supported more quickly. The new guidance and the application form aligns closely with the delivery of the 3 outcomes and 4 investment principles that are in our strategy, Let's Create. And so what we're seeking is that in those applications is for people to tell us about how the work they'll deliver will help us deliver our strategy. Claire, anything else you'd want to add?
No, I think that's good. Those are the key changes.
So much. Amazing. Now we'll probably be getting some questions through. Those watching, do just type in your questions at any point in the chat. We've got one question I've got here from someone was sending through in advance, was asking about the question of doing an event that was charitable. If they're working on a musical and they want to do a charity showcase at a local theatre of a new musical that they're working on. So it's partly about developing the musical, putting some of the content on its feet in front of an audience, but it's also partly about raising funding for a charity. And they wondered, is that an issue if they were trying to raise funds for a charity? I know the answer to this, but I'm not going to say anything.
You should answer, James. You should.
I'll get it wrong if I say it now. You say, no, that's when you were there.
Now I'm worried that we'll get it wrong because you know the answer. So my answer is that is a problem. That you can't do a publicly funded activity that is in essence raising funds for another charity. So your budget has to arrive at a zero balance, basically. So your income and your expenditure once your activity is finished must reach zero. And obviously, if you're doing a fundraising activity, you're seeking to make additional money that you then donate to somebody else. And what we can't have is you making that additional money that you then give away to somebody else. So the answer is no, I'm afraid you can't do that.
Exactly. It's one of the rare things where charity is not always a good thing. In this case, we want you to actually make some money, pay the artists. So that was our pre-question, but do send in further questions. I've got a question here about so one of the changes, as you mentioned, is now in the application process, you talk about how your activity delivers to the Let's Create outcomes, the outcomes of the strategy, the creative people, cultural communities, and a creative and cultural community. One question I've heard is people saying, should we try and deliver to only one of those Let's Create outcomes, or is it better if we're delivering to 2 or 3 of the outcomes rather than only one? What's your advice? I mean, I know it's going to be different for different applications. What are you finding in terms of applications addressing several? Do they address too many, too few? What's the sort of approach?
I'd start there. So I'd say, I think we're generally advising people that you should only be responding to an outcome that connects to the work that you are doing and the activities that you're delivering. And that's where you'll make your best case. If that's one outcome, that's fine. If that's more, great. But it's not necessary to respond to more than one if you can't make a strong case against them. And you do, of course, risk weakening your application if you respond to more than one outcome and it's not in a developed way. And so that's kind of the general advice that we're giving.
Brilliant. That's really clear. Thank you. And we know that applications will also sometimes talk about the Let's Create investment principles where relevant to an application. They'll all have to answer, I believe, to the inclusivity and relevance principle. That's relevant to every application. I know people sometimes ask about if they're doing a research and development application for a new musical, which is often the case that, musicals take so many years to develop. So often they'll be applying for a development stage, say a workshop of a new musical, perhaps with an invited audience to test the material out on people from the industry, perhaps a sample of the target audience that they want the musical to speak to. In terms of making a stronger case to inclusivity and relevance, and I know again it's often specific to the individual project, but are there any general tips you can give people on how they might make a strong case? What sort of things should they be considering around the way they describe who the musical is for and who they will invite to a sharing, those kind of things?
You want to go first?
Shall I go first?
Sure.
I'm going to look over here because I've got the investment principles written out as well. I can't always remember them all. That's not true. I can't remember some of the things underneath them. So inclusivity and relevance, you're right, is one of the mandatory investment principles. So everybody who applies has to answer questions against that to show us how they are demonstrating good practice, how they are seeking out to represent communities, how they are broadening the workforce, etc. It's something that's really important to us, and it speaks to our equality objectives. So it's worth putting some considered thought into answering that question. How you make it strong, I think, is to keep it realistic in terms of what you are doing, and try and keep it quite specific. What we can get is quite a lot of very broad, generalized statements of intent, which don't necessarily give us a real picture of what it is you are doing with this project. Even if it's something that you feel is quite small, it's better to be small and specific than to be sort of large and vague, which doesn't really help us. The inclusivity and relevance section is broken down into 3 sections. So you need to consider communities, so that's your audiences, who's participating, but also who you're aiming to reach. And there you can think about long-term audiences as well as your immediate audiences. So if it's an R&D, you can talk to us about those long-term community connections as well. We're looking at workforce and leadership. So if you've got a creative team around you, how have you identified those? What's the process been? And how are they relevant to what it is you're trying to achieve with your project in terms of the target audiences or the communities? And then the last section is the creative case. So that's thinking about how your project contributes to the diversity of stories, the diversity of artistic work that we are seeing represented within the sector. There's a really useful, essential read on our website, which is not long. And I would encourage you just to have a read of that essential read on inclusivity and relevance. Nafeesah, is there anything you would add?
I think you've got it. I think the main thing, just that first thing you said, is be specific. It can sound really effective to go, we're going to reach everyone and we want it to be for everyone, but then we can't really know what that means and who that will be. And so finding the way to show there's meaningful relationships being built or that are in place, whether that's audiences or the workforce or whatever that might be, is the thing that helps build the picture of how you're meeting that investment principle.
Thank you both. That's really, really helpful. Thank you. Got a question here from Jonathan. It's sort of a 2-part question. The first one, I'll do the more specific bit first, which is if they raise, say, 10% in cash funding, and I know that it's still the case that ideally you need to have at least 10% of income from sources other than the Arts Council in an application, ideally. But if they did raise 10% or more in cash funding, would that score better than 10% or more of in-kind support? So is the cash funding going to strengthen an application compared to in-kind support?
This is an interesting one. I don't think my opinion on it is no, it wouldn't make a difference. Maybe I'm interested to see what Claire says, but as assessing applications, it wouldn't make a difference to me. It's about the bigger picture of what that relationship is, who is that partner, who's provided that support, or who is that, what is that in-kind support made up of, rather than necessarily it being whether it's cash or whether it's in kind. They're doing a version of the same thing. Claire, does that sound?
Yeah, so I would agree with that. I think it's about context, and I think it's about proportionality. So there are some contexts where you might want to see cash investment because you might want to see a bit more of that commitment from your partners and evidence of that commitment. You also, sometimes support in kind can be shown to be not always not meaningless, but sometimes not really of tangible value. So so sometimes the support in kind could be weaker where we can't really see that really real tangible value and investment from a partner. But it is about context. So it's always about the project and what makes sense for the project, as Nafeesah says.
Fantastic, thank you. And the first part of Jonathan's question is a bit broader. It's saying, can you walk us through making an Arts Council project grant application from pre-planning to writing? Now, I know that could be an hour-long answer. I guess one thing around this that's a bit more specific is talking through what are the key stages, or and maybe at what stage do you actually make an application in relation to a project? Because I know that's a key question. People feel, how much of the sort of preparation, how many of the partners and the venue and things need to be confirmed before they actually write an application?
Good point. Shall I start, and then we can do it like passing the baton, because it would, like, if we were to walk it through properly, it would be a 45-minute presentation. So we'll do what we can. So the first thing I would say is read the guidance. First off, have a look at the website, read the guidance, have a look at Let's Create, have a look at the outcomes, have a look at the investment principles. There's quite a lot to cover, but read the guidance is the key one there. And then plan your project. So you need to plan it financially, but also logistically. So you need to think about what you're aiming to do. What's your aim? What is the aim of the project, or the mission, or the vision for the project? And then how are you going to resource it? And where is that money going to come from? How are you going to spend it? What are your rates of pay? We want to see artists being paid, so you need to research appropriate rates of pay for the project. And then who are your partners? Who are you going to bring on board? Who's going to support your activity? And how are you going to deliver it? Once you've got to that stage, you've got quite a formed project. You're beginning to think, okay, what are the risks here now? I've got this project. What are the potential challenges that I might face in delivering that project? And we want to see you considering what those risks are and how you might mitigate them. And at that stage, I would say you're probably at the point of thinking about applying. In terms of confirmed partners, penciled venues, get as much confirmed as possible is the advice I would give. You don't have to have everything. And what we will do is, if there's some expected elements to your project, like an expected partner or an expected artist, we will just make it a condition of funding for your first payment that you confirm those elements for us. So you can have some uncertainty, but if it's all uncertain, it poses quite a big risk. If you've got elements that are uncertain or unconfirmed, that's okay. We can confirm them once you've got the grant. So that takes us up to the application. Nafeesah, do you want to do the application bit?
Yeah, and I guess the key things I'd say is, as you're working your way through the application, is make your case, be specific in what you're saying. Use that guidance still to help you respond to those questions. More often than not, there isn't a hidden question beneath the question. It is literally asking you what it's saying. So try to respond directly to that. I think there's often a worry of what do they really want me to say? And you can get distracted and start responding to other things that aren't the actual question or what the guidance is advising you to consider when answering those questions. So to think about that at that stage, put in the detail that you can, so that we can get a clear picture of what that project is. And have someone read it, someone who doesn't know your project. I think that's the key thing. If they've got questions about it, they're probably the ones we might have. If you want to ask them at the end, what do you think I want to do? And if they can't tell you, we might have those same questions. So that's just a little thing that I always say to people to think about, because we're coming at it from a place of not having all the context and information that you're sitting with in your head. So really take the time to make sure you allow for it to be considered and get that input from other people.
Yeah. A tip On the form, you've got, well, some of the feedback we've had on the new form is that it's difficult to know how to place your project within the new questions. And the investment principles and the outcomes are intended for you to talk about your project, to illustrate how your project meets those. So you can put detail in there about your project specifically. But the opening, there is something called essential information. So you give your project a title, and then you have a short, I think it's 800 characters description of what your project is. And in the guidance, there are some bullet point prompts, and I would definitely encourage you to follow those bullet point prompts just to make sure that in that essential little tiny summary of what your project is, you just give the reader a really clear understanding of your project as a whole. And those prompts are really, really useful. And then I suppose is it useful to know then once you press submit, it goes to an investment centre in Manchester, and they read that and they look at it in terms of risk. So whether you've got a balanced budget, how many of your partners are confirmed, that sort of thing, and eligibility. If it's deemed ineligible, you'll be told straight away and that your application won't be taken forward. If it is taken forward, then it comes to the area from which you applied. So if you have a London address, then it will come to London. And for an under 30,000 application, your application will be read by the panel. So there's no intermediary report or anything like that. So it's important, as Nafeesah said, that you make sure somebody else has read your application before you submit it, so that you can be confident that it's clear. And it won't always be read by somebody who is a theatre specialist, a musical theatre specialist. It could be somebody from visual arts. So don't assume that they have knowledge perhaps that's pertinent to your project and your creative process. Give us that detail wherever possible.
Thank you so much. It's fantastic. The sort of 5-minute version of 45 minutes worth of information. It's like total guru advice this is. I can't recommend it highly enough, these top tips to follow. And another question here from Steve watching live, and that is to ask, what is your views of a commercial as opposed to a niche or minority project? And I guess we're talking about this in the context of musical theatre. We know that musical theatre is often seen as a more commercial art form. So I guess the lead part of that is talking about how would in project funding a commercial, not as in profit making, because that would be ineligible, but in terms of a more mainstream sort of, maybe in the future it might be West End bound, but for now it's somewhere like Southwark Playhouse or Hope Mill Theatre, or a smaller, for a show that's not actually profit making but is more mainstream appeal. Does that still have a chance of being funded compared to a musical that is perhaps a little bit more experimental, or perhaps is more focused on a particular target community?
Yeah, I think it can, is what I'd say. To make it competitive, I think it's about going back to the Let's Create strategy, looking at those outcomes and really the elements of the outcomes, and you can find those on our website. And if you can find within that the parts of what you're doing that connect to delivering against the strategy, that might be, for creative people, one of the outcomes is, one of the elements of the outcome is supporting people at all stages of their lives to design, develop, and increase their participation in high quality creative activities. So that might be something that connects, or, developing and improving pathways towards careers in the creative industries could be something that is still happening. It might not be the lead part of what's going on, which could impact on how competitive that application is, but there are ways in which to make your case. And I think looking at the elements is where you can find where your intent for the project is coming from and how that connects.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nafeesah. And now a question from Britt, which is is there a web page that has a list of all the recipients of theatre grants and how much they got? So is there somewhere people can get a sense of what is being successful through the scheme?
There is. So we publish all our data on our website. I don't think I can post a link here, but we can share some links with James and Emily maybe to share with you. But on the website, we publish a spreadsheet of all the successful awards. Obviously, we don't publish those that are unsuccessful. And you will get a sense, you can see there the name of the applicant, the organisation or the artist, how much they received and where they're located. And you can, if you download the Excel spreadsheet, you can apply a filter across the top, and you can then filter it by art form or filter it by Arts Council area. So you could filter down to theatre and London just to see what's been funded in London.
Amazing, thank you. A general question here, in terms of, I know this used to come up in the past quite a bit. We all know about there's historically cases where musicals have first debuted into the world via a concept recording, like Jesus Christ Superstar or various Andrew Lloyd Webber musicals in particular that were first released as recordings. And occasionally people are still trying to do this, where they want to make a recording first before they do a stage show. If it was a recording, though, is that something that would be eligible to apply for project funding support, or do they really need to wait until there's some kind of a live audience engagement possibility around a show?
I'd say, well, I could have a go, but maybe stop me if I'm getting it wrong. I'd say you probably can go for it if you can show the long-term impact that will be had for audiences. And that's where you can make your case. Does that, you say so, Claire?
I would say so. I think it's about what do you plan to do with that concept recording? So it would be about convincing us of the need for it, but then also how you're going to use it to make sure that you then move your project onto its next stage, and hopefully also to a live audience of some sort.
Thank you. And in relation to that, we all know there's been a proliferation of digitally staged musicals. Going forward, as we're no longer in a lockdown, is this still something that project funding might support? If someone was making a musical that was happening within the digital medium and was going to be live streamed to audiences, what would they need to be thinking about in terms of evidencing the demand and that they really will reach an audience, rather than just putting it out there into the nothingness of the internet?
I think you answered your question in the sense that that's exactly what you need to think about. We saw, obviously, during the various lockdowns, we saw an awful lot of work, being put onto digital platforms, which was brilliant and really exciting for the sector, and has brought about a sort of real change and engagement with digital. But at the same time, there wasn't always a lot of thought about how that sort of platform would be used and how you would reach your audiences. So it sort of felt like put it out there and they will come, rather than really having a strategy about who you're trying to reach. Why is that the best platform for this piece of work for the target audience? How will you get them to come to that digital experience? What do you hope them to, what do you hope to gain? What do you hope for them to gain? And then maybe how will you build on that connection? Is there any way that you can build on that relationship at all, and how do you plan to do that? So yeah, you need to give it some thought, but definitely it's something we would still be keen to support, I think.
Fantastic. And we mentioned before about sometimes applications being ineligible. Are there any sort of most frequently seen reasons why applications aren't eligible?
From my experience, that it's more they're underdeveloped, that things aren't completed that need to be, that there's gaps in information. But I'm sure Claire can be more specific, because at that stage I've not really done a lot in.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. That's fundamentally it. I think the most common reason for ineligibility is that somebody hasn't really given us enough information on the form to be able to reach an informed decision. The other reason is that income outweighs expenditure, so the budget doesn't balance, and so that will just be popped back, and that's quite easily fixed. You just need to look at the budget again and then submit it. And then sometimes, but very rarely, if the project that you're proposing sits outside our remit, so if you are working in feature film, for example, or high fashion, something like that, where it just doesn't fit with the disciplines that we are delegated to support, basically.
Amazing, thank you. Another question from Jonathan here, and that it's sort of related to, you know, we all know in musical theatre one of the biggest needs is more resource towards writers writing, because it takes so long to develop a musical, and often it is self-funded. So this question is about, can the writing team include time to write within a wider application? So say the first half, it might be £15,000, is towards, they're calling it a self-commission, but time for them to pay themselves as a writing team to write the musical for a specific period of time, alongside the second half of an application being another 15,000 towards workshopping and showcasing the material that they've been writing. Can they apply for the time to write alongside the workshop sharing of the musical and development?
Yeah, I think so is the answer. Yes, you can. Again, it's about how you make that application competitive with telling that story of what's that second half going to look like, and what's that R&D going to do. Are there partners in place? Are there people ready to help work on that project to, you know, bring it to life and to connect with audiences in the long term? I think the other thing is finding, you know, it's not really the right thing to look at DYCP necessarily for this, but it is something to consider if you're looking to try something new or different in your practice. Then that might also be a fund to consider.
DYCP is developing your creative practice. Arts Council.
I've turned into an Arts Council person who uses acronyms.
We love our acronyms. Yeah, developing your creative practice. No, I think that's absolutely right. I think the key will be, won't it, about demonstrating. If you're self-commissioning, it's about demonstrating that viability, that it will get sort of out there and into the public domain at some point. So that could be about your track record. So maybe you've already had some success in getting work out there. So a period of self-writing feels like a good thing to do, and we can see that you've managed to get work into the public domain before. Or it could be that you need to evidence that there is interest in that process happening, that other people, other venues, other partners are interested in that and kind of want to see that before they will maybe fully commit to the project. But there's definite interest there in seeing that process happen.
Makes sense. And if people put an application in and it's not successful first time, do they have to wait a period of time before they reapply? What are the circumstances under which they can try again?
You can reapply pretty much straight away, but the key thing is making sure that you address the things that are kind of, you're given a tailored statement of feedback from the panel. So you should ensure that you're addressing the feedback that you're given in that, and that you've developed your application in the ways that have been set out there.
There's one change which is quite useful actually in the over 30,000 applications. So if you apply for over 30, rather than your application going straight to panel, somebody like me or Nafeesah will write a report, an appraisal report on your application, sort of summarising its strengths and weaknesses for panel. And a new element in the appraisal is now the option to add in development statements. So the appraiser will put in some development statements, whether or not they're recommending your project for funding. So if you are successful and you're in over 30, I would always encourage you to look at the appraisal to see what it was and how it was talked about, and how the appraiser kind of highlighted the strengths and weaknesses. But also, if it was unsuccessful, go and look at those development statements to see where particularly they feel like your application could be strengthened.
Fantastic, thank you. And I realise we've only got about 5 minutes left of your precious time, so we've got a few more questions launching in. A question here from Ruth, which is, what is the current success rate within London compared to the success rate outside of London? I guess the subtext to this is, do you stand more of a chance applying if you live outside London compared to applying within London, where we know with musical theatre, certainly there's so many of the people writing musicals are London-based?
So I don't know the success rate off the top of my head, and it does vary slightly from meeting to meeting, but it is around the 30 to 33% success rate. I think it is a bit higher outside of London. It's not massively higher, but it is a bit less competitive outside of London, but it's still competitive. I think you apply from your postcode, basically. So I wouldn't engineer trying to apply from somewhere else just for the sake of thinking that it might be less competitive. You don't know what you'll be up against from one panel to the next, so it's better to just go with your application. I mean, but it is competitive in London, I'm not going to lie, it is.
Totally makes sense. And a question from Michael: do all songs need to be completed and recorded for our musical before we apply for an Arts Council grant, or are 2 enough? We have written 2 songs so far. So I guess this might be partly about the stage of development, that there's only a couple of songs written for the musical so far. Does that mean it needs to be further along before they can evidence this is the track we're on, or can they apply at an early stage in the writing process?
I think it probably depends on what they're applying for. If they're applying to do an R&D to try out where they're at and to help develop the rest of that musical, then that might be enough to, spend a week on and have that funded. But yeah, if you were trying to apply to go closer towards, a rehearsal period, then that would be a high risk and be identified by the panel, I think, as such. So I think it's, again, that thing about the context of what you're applying for, and that being how to make that assessment of what amount you need in place.
Thank you. And a question from Barbara, which is, if you've been successful with an application, how involved is the Arts Council with the project after that point? Can you ask questions in terms of further development with it? She's saying, is if they need help finding creatives, contacting venues, etc., is that something they can talk to the Arts Council about?
Generally not, I would say. I mean, it's about capacity more than anything else. So in the London Theatre team, we're a team of 9 relationship managers managing 75 regularly funded organisations, plus a whole host of project grants, clients, and other funds. So we don't really have the capacity to go into that level of development support with individual applicants. We do put a lot of information on our website, and quite a lot of useful information on our website, so it's worth having a peruse there. But we fund organisations like MTN and MMD in order to do some of that development work for us, because we don't have the capacity.
That's a nice segue to saying, yes, do contact us instead. Members of MTN and MMD get advice giving sessions. We can always signpost you to creatives in the Friday mail out. We can put mail outs to say this is what someone's looking for. So absolutely contact us and we can help you. We've got a flurry of last minute questions in our final 2 minutes. So these might be single sentence answers. One is a question from Ruth saying, we want to tap into mentoring from Broadway in terms of the development of our musical. Can we include some kind of an international partnership within our application?
Yes. Is that a good one?
That's a nice quick question. Hey, as long as the benefit's back here in the UK, is that right? Or to a degree?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, if you're talking about an international mentor, then yes, and you're mentoring a UK, an English artist. So we are Arts Council England, so that's our focus. But yes, absolutely, as Nafeesah says.
Brilliant. And going back to an earlier point you made, if the reason someone's application wasn't successful is listed as other applications are preferred, they were saying, how do you learn and develop from that? Or does it mean that you don't have to change as much about the application you initially submitted?
Shall I go? It means generally that there wasn't enough money to fund all the good projects that the panel had in front of them, and your application was just pipped by another application. So in theory, you could take that application and resubmit it, but I would always say you have an opportunity just to go back and relook at it and just tweak it, just make sure you are making it as strong as you can. So whilst you've got that opportunity, you may as well, but you don't generally have to with other applications preferred. It is a financial running out of money.
Amazing. And then final question before we love you and leave you is, someone saying, this is Laurel's question, asking, I've had 2 rounds of R&D funding for writing a folk musical in public. Most of the funding goes on my collaborating artists, not my time as the writer of the piece. Do you have any advice for me on how I can get match funding for composition? I think this question is asking about how do I better resource my writing time within the process alongside paying for my collaborators on the project?
That's a tough one. I think the key thing is we'd say when you're applying to us, you should be allowing for your time in that too. It's not, it's about the whole project and every artist being supported in that process. There's a definite temptation I found in advice sessions where people are thinking about everyone else but themselves. But we want to see that fair pay for everyone working on a project. And of course, then it's seeing what other potential partners are out there that are the relevant ones to be supporting you for the specific project that you're doing.
Yeah, brilliant. I think just to add, if it means that you have to apply for more money in order to pay yourself and others properly, we would rather see you do that than weaken your application by not paying yourself properly.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Nafeesah and Claire. You have been so helpful. I know our members are so grateful for your advice, and they'll be watching this going forwards as well to catch up in the next few days. But really grateful for your time and sage advice. Thank you so much. We've now got 3 new panelists waiting in the waiting room. It's like conveyor belt. But thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your evenings. We're so grateful for your time. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thanks for having us. Have a nice evening.
Bye.
You too. And hopefully we have 3 new panelists joining us right now. We haven't done this before. If you'd like to turn on your cameras, welcome to Elizabeth Sills and to Neil Marcus and to Fiona Mallin-Robinson. Thank you so much for joining us. We're just going live straight from having been talking for 45 minutes with our wonderful specialists from Arts Council England. And now we're going into part 2 of today's event, talking about project funding. And we are joined by the lovely Elizabeth Sills from the PRS Foundation, Fiona Mallin-Robinson, who works with the John Lyons charity and is a fundraising consultant, and Neil Marcus, who is a prolific fundraiser as a producer of many musical theatre titles, and is also working with us at MMD and MTN at the moment. And I think we're rejoined by Emily Gray as well, our co-host, which is fantastic, is back with us as well. So as before, those of you who are joining us live, do continue to send in questions through the chat and YouTube, and Fiona McKeown, our wonderful membership and communications manager, will ferry those questions through to us in the Zoom call so that we can ask our panelists your questions. We'll get our panelists to just introduce themselves a little bit further, to tell you a little bit more about the areas that they might be able to advise you on in terms of project funding for musical theatre. And do ask away, just ask general questions or specific questions to a particular panelist if there's someone that you want to specifically ask about. But to begin with, maybe Elizabeth, can you tell us a little bit about your role with PRS Foundation and about the relevant funds that people can apply to?
Hi, yeah, thank you, James, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks. I'm Elizabeth Sills. I'm the Grants and Programs Manager at PRS Foundation. I work across many different funds, but I think that the most appropriate fund for anyone attending this meeting will be to look at our open funding and Women Make Music. Through open funding for music creators, we can offer up to £5,000 for projects that can kind of move your career forward as a creator. And we also have our Women Make Music fund, which is was set up nearly 10 years ago now to address the imbalance in the industry, and that's for those music creators who identify as women, to apply for up to £5,000 worth of funding also. When the next deadline hasn't been confirmed yet, but we should be hopefully opening the form in May, but we have moved from 3 deadlines to 2 deadlines a year. So that's just to keep that in mind.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Elizabeth. Just wanted to jump in here and say good evening to everyone. I'm Emily Gray from MMD, and I just wanted to move on to Neil Marcus. And Neil, would you be able to just introduce us and maybe just give us a flavour of some of the successes you've had around fundraising for musicals? I know that's a very broad question, but I'm sure you can give us the highlights, please.
Sure. So I've raised money for different musical theatre projects, from Arts Council grants, from crowdfunding campaigns, from event galas, from trusts and foundations, from investors. So there's quite a mixed economy in terms of how and where one might look for money depending on the project and what's suitable. But in most of what I've done, funding from other sources has been key to getting it on.
Fantastic, thanks, Neil. And over to Fiona. Can you tell us a bit more, Fiona, about, I know you've got a broader experience base with several trusts and foundations. What would you say is the landscape currently in terms of people applying to trusts and foundations for musical theatre? Are there any that you think these are the kind of foundations they might approach, or how would people go about finding out about the kind of priorities that a trust or foundation has to invest in? Like for the John Lyons charity, where would people find out what it's likely to support?
Yeah, I think it's I mean, you know, I don't want to be a bearer of bad news, but it is a hugely competitive field at the moment, and you know, for all sorts of reasons. With regard, I work as an arts advisor to John Lyons charity, and I've been involved with them because I first got involved because I was sitting on the other side of the fundraising table trying to raise money, and that's how I met them. So I've worked on both sides of it, from fundraising to now grant making. And I think in all cases, you know, when you're looking for a funder and when you're looking at a funder, you sort of want to look for them in a similar way that you would look for your creative team. You need to find a good fit, and you need to put in as much time researching that as you possibly can. John Lyons charity in particular is a grant making trust that supports organisations for the benefit of young people in 9 London boroughs. So it's a place-based funder. So it's quite specific, but you know, and I think that is the thing with trusts and foundations. They each have their, if it's not a specific, if it's not place-based, it might be that it's the particular guiding principles of the time, and those can also shift. So you need to be keeping up to date with the changes that everyone is making to their strategies, and keeping an eye out on what people are funding. You know, when you go and see a show, get the programme, not just to support the company, but also so you can look at those supporter pages and see who's interested in supporting what.
Right, oh, that's wonderful advice, thank you. What a strong panel, that's great. And we actually have our first question that's come in specifically for Elizabeth at PRS. And the question, Elizabeth, so we're aware that PRS funds composers and talks about music creators. Would it be possible for a book writer of a musical, who's in essence writing words, could also be writing lyrics potentially, could they apply? Would they be counted as a music creator if they're not actually the composer in a project?
That's a good question. I mean, I would ask, are they essentially, as the lyricist, writing the musical, like the music that comes with the words?
So it's so interesting. So in MMD, of course, we have such a mix of book writers, lyricists, composers, and so often they will work as a collaborative team. But and I don't know the specifics of this question, but the essence of if, say, the lead person in an application was book and lyrics rather than music, you know, would your advice be to go, actually, no, it's much better to be applying along with a team where
yeah, I mean, sorry, I keep losing you, Emily. Yeah, I think I would advise it's best to apply as a team.
Music's going to be part of it as well, or would PRS, yeah, look at a writer who doesn't specifically write the musical element?
It really is about, you know, what the end goal is. Like, so, you know, we're looking to, so if someone is coming to us to write a musical, it's like, where is that writing going to get to? Like, so if they're applying for their time to write the musical, I mean, that's something that we can fund, but there needs to be plans in place as to where it gets to and what the finished kind of result is. I'm sorry, I'm unsure if I'm answering this question properly, but for me at PRS Foundation, it's about the musical that is being created by the composers involved. So it would be about the music creator. So I think it would be, you know, mainly about the composer and their development. But it really depends on, you know, what the finished item is.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And a question for Neil now. I know, or in terms of, I don't want to speak for you, you've had some real success with project funding for particular musicals that you've produced. I wonder, is there an example that you can just talk us through where you've applied for project funding to give us a sense of what the sort of model is of how you've applied for funding and that sat alongside income from other sources to make a musical, to make a new musical ideally be viable for the stage?
Sure. I mean, one good example is the Buskers Opera, which was at Park Theatre in 2016, and it was based on the Beggars Opera, which also was the point for the Threepenny Opera and Dead Man in a Suitcase and all sorts of shows. But the essence of that show was about community. It always was when it was set up back at Hammersmith in the 1860s or whenever John Gay's show first came out. So when we did it, we were talking about reaching out to our wider community. And we wrote to the Arts Council for a grant saying that we were looking to use local students and local artists and lots of community events and a competition to sort of widen the reach. And we did the same with the local authority. And both of them funded the project because it was being true to the intention of the original work. But on top of that, there were other sources we went to. So, for example, the Noel Coward Foundation and the Lionel Bart Foundation don't just support work by Noel Coward or Lionel Bart, but there needs to be some relationship. For example, Noel Coward was a great mentor to lots of people. So if there is mentorship involved, that might be something that appeals. And it's about looking at these foundations to that particular foundation, or the Limbury Trust, and the Garrick Trust. And you look at all the trusts that come from a theatrical pedigree, and you figure out whether or not what you're actually asking for is relevant. And what about sponsorship? I did a show called The A to Z of Mrs. P about Phyllis Pearsall, who wrote The A to Z. She walked the streets of London, theoretically, and put this book together. And we got support and sponsorship from map makers and people associated with that particular subject matter. So I think it's about trying to think, okay, who would be interested in supporting this and why, and what PR could they gain from it, and what benefits and what corporate perks in terms of taking people to the show could they get from it, and what's reasonable for them to support. So it's a whole mixture of different things, as well as looking at the potential box office revenue, which in most cases won't support the production.
Thank you, Neil. That's great. I was chatting to someone the other day, I think I mentioned this to you, where we were talking about how is this business sustainable? And it's that sad thing, isn't it, that for so many musicals, from a purely commercial perspective, they wouldn't be sustainable really without all these sources of funding. That we need philanthropy, we need the patronage effectively of trusts and foundations to make so many of these shows valuable. They're so valuable in the ecology of musical theatre being possible in this country.
And don't knock patronage, because there are people who happen to be affluent, who love musical theatre, that might like a project and might want to see, you know, for a potential investment in the future of the show, might help it with its first iteration.
Thank you. A question for Fiona now. This is coming from Jonathan, and he's saying, for those who have never applied to a trust before, in a nutshell, what is the process from pre-planning, writing and submitting the application, and what happens after submission? I mean, obviously every trust and foundation is probably different, but can you give us an example of what the process might be around the trust actually processing an application? What sort of assessment do they go through? An assessment? How does it work?
It really does. You're quite right, James. It really does vary from trust to trust, and the process can be achingly slow. Not for John Lyon's charity, of course, but you know, for it can be a slow process, or it can be very quick, and a lot of that will depend on who you're applying to as well and what your project is. With regards to thinking about it as a process and breaking it down into kind of what you can do, I think the first starting point is obviously working out a good way to communicate about your project in bite-sized paragraphs that are probably going to fit into an online application form. A lot of trusts and foundations now are online application forms. And so, as Neil said, you know, start by looking at those trusts that you kind of, you know, will have an interest in musical theatre or the special thing that it is about your project. Go onto their website, and I would say the first thing to look at is what they don't fund. You don't want to find that you've spent half a day constructing a beautiful application, only then to look at their what they do and what they don't fund, to find that, oh, actually, I have to be a registered charity and I'm not, or, you know, whatever that is. So look at what they don't fund. Make sure that don't try and force yourself to fit their guidance. If you don't fit, move on. You will find someone else that you do fit with. So I think, you know, doing your research, understanding what your special project is so that you can see where it fits into their application. And then it's just going through applications. A lot are online now. The first step might not be an application form. The first step might be a letter, a 2-page letter, in which case, you know, hone your writing skills. Make sure that people can tell when you're just sending out a blanket letter to loads of approaches. And I would say, you know, every trust is different. If you've got the time to make little tweaks to your approaches so that they are bespoke and targeted at the organisation you're going to, then I think it is definitely worth the time. Of course, if you can pick up the phone and speak to a grants manager, speak to someone, meet someone who works at the trust that you want to apply to, then that's great. But trusts and foundations vary, and some are, you know, you have to earn that personal contact. Neil, you've probably got more some experience of this, and whereas others will keep you, will welcome you in and will work with you to develop your application. And that again, it's very different depending on who the funder is. And have a think about what sort of a funder you want. Would you prefer to work with a funder who really wants to get involved, or actually do you quite like the idea of a funder who's a bit more arm's length and has that sort of a process? Does that answer the question?
That's great, thank you. Yes. There's a question from Neil around the moment when a writers or a collaborative team might bring in a producer. What would be your advice around having to pay that producer to then help you to fundraise or not? How might you go about that? And particularly if it's a non-commercial type of show, is it a good idea to try and get a number of producers on board, or just try with that first person who might help you raise some money? So I wonder if you might be able to give us some scenarios or advice around that, please.
Yeah, I mean, producers cover a wealth of things. There are commercial producers, there are creative producers. I think the first point with anything is have a cup of coffee and see if you're simpatico, and see if the project appeals to you both, in which case you may find a method where, I mean, I think it's all about equality, because if there's no pot, then it may be the producer's responsibility as the financial person in the team to raise that money. But if it's on the understanding that, you know, for their time, once some money comes in, they're entitled to use that before everyone else gets it. At least it's a way of giving them something for their time, getting it going in the first place. It doesn't have to work that way, but it may be a commercial producer that's well financed, in which case it's more about they've got the resource, it's whether the pieces are fit, and what are reasonable fees for you as creatives. So I don't think there is any right or wrong time to bring on a producer. What you want to do is get a producer excited and passionate, in which case they'll find a way to get it on. And everyone does it differently. I mean, you look at American Psycho at the Almeida, they did a crowdfunding campaign. And of course, they had the benefit of a Doctor Who and the Almeida and a tried and tested creative team. But, you know, people were giving a lot of money to have a signed document or a original cast song first, or, you know, so there are fundraising methods that can get you there quite early on, I think.
Thank you. So yes, that really reiterating that message about being clear, about being very transparent and saying whether there is budget or there isn't, and that you're all starting from the same point of understanding.
Yeah,
Thank
I mean,
you.
so if you want to, if they want to do a workshop, then you would expect a producer to be paid like a director and like a musical director, and that's a fee, and that's straightforward. If it's the producer of the project, it might be that you all go in good faith and see from the ground up where you get to, you know.
Great, thank you.
And a question for Elizabeth now. This is from Anita, who's asking, and this is kind of building on the question before about book writers with musical theatre. Anita's question is more over the bridge into opera. We don't usually talk about opera here, but this is relevant to PRS, I think. She's saying, so for PRS, would you fund the lyricists who are writing the libretto or the lyrics for an opera, or is it just the music bit that would be eligible to apply to PRS Foundation? And asking more generally, is operatic writing in general, is opera something that can be applied for to the PRS Foundation?
Yeah, you can apply for opera to the PRS Foundation, but what I understand from seeing many opera and musical theatre applications is that it is a very long process in creating the new work. And so it's kind of, you know, we've had applications for opera coming in before where they've been applying for the composer to write the opera, but there's no real plan as to how the opera is going to get out there. So I'm just going to kind of like put it, you know, you can apply as an organization, and that would be involved. So that would be kind of like commissioning a composer and a lyricist. But with the opera, you would have the libretto. I don't know. It's a grey area, I do admit it, and it's something, you know, for us to kind of really look into. But for us, it is about the kind of development for the composer involved. So it would be main. But if you're an organisation, you would be applying for the opera as a whole, and that would be funding the lyricist and the composer. Whereas if you're applying as an individual, if you are the book writer or a lyricist, as we're talking about, it's about how the music's going to come in with that, and how the opera or the music theatre is going to be created. Because the projects that we fund are the ones that have got it all together, and that it's mainly ready to go, and it's all planned out, and you just need the money to fund it. It doesn't mean that like everything needs to be confirmed, but the plan needs to be set out. So really it's about that kind of thing about what the end result is, like thinking. So before you were to apply for PRS Foundation, thinking about where the end result is, how the opera or the musical theatre production, which are both eligible for funding through PRS Foundation, but how it's going to get out there, basically, yeah, if that builds on the question from before.
Lovely, thank you. And there's another question that might sit with you, Elizabeth, but might go to somebody else. But there's a writer who is asking about, rather than making new work, reviving and reimagining existing musicals and operas, which I imagine, could involve some reinterpretation, some rewriting. Could they come to you, or do we go to the other panelists and kind of see where they might think about fundraising for that sort of a project?
This is, it depends, what they're applying for and how much it differs from the original work. A lot of people will apply for, new versions or an adapted versions of old tales, like we've funded Red Riding Hood opera for children that was a reimagination of it. But it depends how much it really differs from the original, because for us it is about new music. So if it's new music that's being created with this opera, then yes, but you just have to make that completely clear in the application, that it is new music based on, so it doesn't just look like it's another performance of something already written. It really just depends. It just has to be quite clear that although it's based on something, the music is new.
Thank you.
Now a general question about funding for writers' time. We know this is something that we were talking to Arts Council England before, and it's very hard to make a strong enough case in terms of sort of public engagement in an Arts Council application around an application that is purely for time to write. And we know with musicals, so much of the creative process is just the long, hard slog of writing that musical. I guess asking all three of you, what are your views on where people can apply for funding or can source funding towards supporting time to write for a musical? Yep, Elizabeth, do you want to jump in?
We do support time to write, but sorry to hark on about this continuously, but it would be the music creator applying to us for time to write the musical, but kind of making it clear that they've had interest and it's why it's the right time for them. So it would be, success building on a previous musical that they might have had, and then, they have been offered these opportunities, or this has come about, and it's why it's the right time for them to write the musical and what their plans are to get the musical out there. So, I mean, that could involve, a recording instead of a production or something like that. But there needs to be a live or recorded element following the writing in plans in place, really. So you can apply for your own time. So you'd be applying up to £5,000 to write this, but they would need to be an end result live or recorded.
I mean, I know the Arts Council, and they've been on do research and development grants, because I'm a firm believer that writers should be paid for their time. And if you're writing a musical, it could be 2 or 3 years of your life. And if the fee is a few £1,000s, that's not going to cover living costs for 3 years. And of course, if you're doing a workshop, people should be paid for their time there as well. But an R&D grant may be a way to pay everyone a small amount to get the thing off the ground and start raising awareness.
And I think Spotlight possibly has a page where it lists charities that support individual artists. So that might just be something to have a look at too.
I would just like to add that funders would encourage you to apply for many different funds or at the same time. A lot of people sometimes say to us, oh, should we apply to you or should we apply to this person? Apply to both, basically. As long as it never looks like your budget means that you actually need support, it's absolutely fine to apply for as many funders as possible. And, you know, having confirmed funding from one organisation can be beneficial to another. So I would, yeah, just apply for as many places as possible. I know it takes a long time to fill out applications, funding application forms, but as many as you can.
Sorry, we were just losing some of the sound to that
Sorry.
last bit, Elizabeth.
Sorry, I was just waffling on, like just saying I understand they're all time consuming, so I don't want to be like, oh, apply to 100 funds. I'm just meaning you can apply to several at the same time, and if you were to get, say, Arts Council, that could look good for PRS Foundation or vice versa. And also one organisation we haven't brought up is Help Musicians UK, who I think will fund time as well, but obviously it's not, it's in the realms of the same amount of up to like 3,000 or 5,000, but they also have a funding wizard on their page where you can look at loads of different funders as well.
Thank you so much. Of course, we've all had the experience, and we'll keep having the experience of being unsuccessful in fundraising. It just happens. And I just wonder if on the panel you have advice for people who have been knocked back maybe once or a couple of times, but want to keep going. But yes, well, how do we make ourselves as fundraisers? How do we make ourselves more resilient? How do we, think about reapplying, possibly with the same project, time and time again, because we believe in it, but it's getting knocked back? What advice would you give, please?
I think it's worth being realistic, and when you set out, acknowledging that 1 or 2 out of your 10 approaches is likely to be successful, so that you've got a realistic standpoint. So if you do get some knockbacks, it doesn't mean your application's bad. It just means it's a competitive environment, or they haven't got any money, or there are other applications out there that fit what they're looking for better at this point in time. But certainly that point in time thing is important. What might be not great now might really be on trend 6, 9, 12 months down the line.
Yeah, I think that's the absolute key. You've just got to keep on keeping on, really, and you will get knockbacks, but you can be safe in the knowledge that you are in very good company, because everyone will be getting some knockbacks. And I always think there's that. When I was working fundraising, it always reminded me of being in that short story by D.H. Lawrence. I don't know if you know it, called The Rocking Horse Winner, where the little boy Paul rides his rocking horse, because when he rides his rocking horse, he gets visions of race horses that then win, and then his family win loads of money by betting on them. And when he rides his rocking horse, he says, there must be more money, there must be more money, there must be more money. And I think you just got to stay on the rocking horse, and you'll get there in the end.
I would like to add on Fiona's point from earlier, just to make sure that which funders offer what they're offering in their eligibility and criteria, because like Fiona said, often you can spend a long time applying for something that isn't actually eligible through that funder. So PRS Foundation is new music and talent development, so if you've already brought that musical out and it's already happened and you want to tour it somewhere else, then we couldn't fund it, or so that would be someone else. In terms of feedback, I mean, most funders will offer some form of feedback. I can't speak for all of them. We do offer feedback, and in the terms of at least a workshop occasionally, but it's also like Fiona says, you're in good company but it is about realizing just exactly how competitive it is. Like we just received 900 applications for maybe like 50 grants. You know what I mean? That's where it's at. I would say that make it incredibly clear what you want to apply for, and I'm sure you are, but don't always assume that people understand what it is you're applying for, because get someone who doesn't work in musical theatre at all to read it before you send it off, so it makes complete sense. And you know, if you're writing a musical, like what are the how are you going to get the music out there, and how are people going to hear it? What do you have any audience plans? Just make sure that the plan you're submitting is the right one at the right time, and you can justify it really, and have as much information there as possible. Like, you know, budgets are important. You need to have the same income as outgoings, and you know, if the budget's massive and it doesn't, and you don't have anything confirmed, it's unlikely that you would be successful. Sorry, I'm just rambling on, but I think, you know, hopefully that will help. But a lot of our grantees actually only get funding, you know, after, you know, 3-4 times of applying. So I just want to say that, you know, it is possible to get funding after being rejected.
That's great. That's really encouraging to hear. Thank you. Great advice. Thanks.
Can I ask a question from Elizabeth and Fiona? In that we're saying, you know, check out your grants, but I'm aware of the Directory of Grant Making Trusts, but that costs money that you can look at online. Are there any resources that are available that are not at any cost to identify which trusts and foundations might be the most suitable?
I think Musical Theatre Network lists some on their website in their resources section. I was looking at this earlier actually, because you're quite right. A lot of the resources are things that you have to pay for, and which is why I kind of always think look in programs and look on, you know, people's websites to see who's supporting what. I don't I mean, Elizabeth, you might know better than me, but I don't think there is a one-stop shop that will tell you all the answers that you want, sadly. Although MTN does a very good job. But I think, you know, you do need to then, exactly what Elizabeth says, you do need to look at the individual, what people are supporting individually, and go on it and it is time consuming and laborious, and you also need to be very clear on what you're asking for of the different people, but you can ask more than one person at the same time. Yeah, but no, I don't, Neil, is the short answer. I don't think.
No, I would add on that that I mentioned earlier. Help Musicians UK have a funding wizard, which is a search engine on their website. I mean, it's for all music, but it can be useful to finding those like small trusts, because, you know, some trusts are so specific and you would never find them otherwise. But it gives you some options, you can type them in and then it comes up with some available trusts to find.
Thank you all. That's really, really useful. It sounds like it's the age-old thing of asking around. Word of mouth is the great advice, isn't it? On sort of, and programs are a bit of word of mouth on who's been successful with who. A question now from Jonathan, and this is to everyone. It's sort of asking around the nature of the collaboration that needs to be confirmed when people are putting in an application. Do they need to have a collaboration agreement in place with their collaborators on a musical ahead of putting in an application? Would a trust or foundation ever request to see documentation of what the level of contract is amongst collaborators working on a musical? Or is that just taken as a given that there will be, you know, a due diligence has been done in terms of the collaboration before they apply? Any thoughts on that?
I think it totally depends on what you're applying for, really, on what level of documentation on that kind of thing you'd need to provide. So yeah, I don't think there's a straightforward sorry, but you know,
makes sense.
Yeah, so
the R&D stuff for the Arts Council, what they say is, are the artists confirmed? They don't say, have you got a contractual agreement, but they say, are the artists confirmed?
And Elizabeth's nodding from PRS as well. I presume it's similar ruling, isn't it?
I mean, we don't ask for any proof of any of these things, but you know, we would, if we were to offer funding, we would give you like it's, you know, you receive 50% up front and then the final 50% when we evaluation of how it's all gone. So everything would have needed to be in place, basically. There are some times where we will ask for a condition or something, but it's, you know, we will kind of go on what's on the application. There is like things that say provisional and confirmed. So if everything was provisional but everyone wanted to support the project, it would be a situation of having that condition that those things are confirmed. But most of the time, it's down in the evaluation process, really.
Great, thank you all. And then perhaps inevitably we do have a COVID question. So knowing that we've been through very challenging few years, you know, we have an awareness that the funding landscape has kind of been reshaped. And I think there are, you know, in some lights that's in a, you know, there are negative things about there being less money around and more competition. But could you talk to us about whether there are new opportunities that have come out of that, or what we can be hopeful about in terms of a reshaped landscape post-COVID?
I think if we're talking positively, you know, I think something like a digital musical or digital opera would be well within the realms of applying for, or, you know, involving VR in different ways, or things that aren't necessarily live for a live audience in person, that you could apply for those things now, I think.
Lovely, thank you. Any thoughts from Fiona or Neil on that, on things that have, yeah, new opportunities that we have?
I mean, in terms of raising money, I've done a couple of fundraisers that were more successful because it was locked down, because the artists were available. So they helped a artistic institution, but I don't think it's necessarily about making work. It's more about, there was a time and a place where you might be able to access talent that you couldn't if they were working live in theatre. But I suspect that time has passed.
You know, we haven't funded it, but things that I have seen things on Instagram, like a digital opera, interactive opera, and musical theatre. And I guess it's a new way of showcasing your work. And that is some way that is something that you could now apply to funders for if you came up with the right case for it.
And I think one positive outcome on that as well, sort of building on that point, is that we've all learned to be a lot more flexible. You know, I think the fundraising landscape generally, from a trust and foundation point of view, is a lot more open and flexible, and, well, I would hope so, and accepting that things change, you know, and that's a good thing.
No, absolutely. Thank you all. It's good to have some optimism, isn't it? On these sunny days, it feels like it's a little bit more within reach, thankfully. This is another PRS question coming in from Laurel. She says, can you talk a little bit more about the musical examples required as part of an application to PRS? Do you need finished songs for a musical, or can they be general examples of my past composing work?
This again, sorry to sound like a broken record, depending on what you're applying for. So you get 2 music examples and they both have a time limit on them. So please do not submit anything longer for the time limit, and that applies for every funder. A lot of people submit like an hour-long YouTube clip, and no advisor is going to listen to that. I'm sorry, and then they might do, but I don't know. But anyway, so I would stick to the time length, and if you are, it depends. I would not suggest submitting anything over a year old, but we have been in the pandemic, so I do understand that recent recordings might not be available. So as recent as you can, and one music example needs to be as relevant to what you're actually applying for. So if you're going down a new angle, you know, you don't want a situation where an advisor will say, well, actually, we don't have any idea what this is that they're making, because they've just submitted some examples that doesn't relate to the project they're applying for. So make sure that you get two examples, so one can showcase your work and the other one needs to be specific to what you're applying for, and that can be demos or whatnot, and something that's not recorded well, as long as one of them shows that you are, you know, out there, professional, doing this, and then the other one can show what this musical is about.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Elizabeth. So this might be one for Neil, but any of the panel could pick it up. It's a question around tips for how to help writers who are, or partnerships, writing partnerships teams who are trying to convince potential venue partners to support them financially in order to help an application. I think, you know, so often there are venues can give support in kind, and that to actually be cash, be money. Any tips on how you might go about that?
I think music always speaks for itself. I mean, this is more about getting a show on, but two very specific examples. When I did Soho Cinders, we'd done a charity West End benefit and recorded it live. So I was able to put a CD in the hand of the artistic director of the then artistic director of Soho Theatre, Steve Marmion, and he liked it and said, yes, we'll do it. So he had some tangible music he could listen to. And when we did the A to Z of Mrs. P, Gwyneth Herbert composed a song which she sung for the A to Z office live and charmed them that way. So certainly music in itself is a great way to woo people. And if you can get the music in front of the people that are making the decision, it's fine. If you mean, how do I get the venue within the application? I think it's the same approach, but saying we're going to apply, you know, obviously we don't expect you to commit, but in principle, if they liked it, would you consider us as a potential show? We're not holding you to it, but for the purpose of the application, so that we've got some reasonable claim to it, you know. So I mean, I'd have an honest conversation with the venue thinks most appropriate and see if you can get them excited about the project. And even if you don't get the grant, you might get the venue excited about the project.
Yes, exactly. So you've got nothing to lose, have you?
No.
Yeah. Thank you, Neil. Thanks.
Again, a general question for everyone. This is coming in from Simon. He's asking, is there any advice to applicants of a culturally diverse background? Are there any particular funding opportunities which support musical theatre writing being funded by applicants of a culturally diverse background? Elizabeth, is there anything? I know there was a fund through PRS, wasn't there? I'm trying to remember the name of it.
So we have Power Up, which is for composers and music industry professionals who identify as Black. So that is specific for that for those people. That's the main fund that we have at PRS Foundation.
I mean, I know we didn't talk about it within the Arts Council part earlier, but obviously within the relevance and inclusiveness principle within Let's Create strategy, there is a priority of diversifying the artists that are supported and diversifying the arts leaders and the creatives that are getting their work staged in the sector. So I think in most applications there's a degree of people weighing up what's the existing landscape and how can we make it more representative of the contemporary UK population. So I think there will always be some degree of that being considered. I mean, am I speaking out of turn for the rest of you? Would anyone disagree with that? I think most trusts and foundations, I presume, would still take some kind of representativeness into account. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, you go first.
No, after you.
Oh, no, a PRS Foundation is really important for us to make sure that the composers and music creators that we support are representative of those living around the UK. So everything, so, you know, all these things are looked at, and we would encourage those applications to come in, basically, because so although we do have power up, but, you know, as you said, James, we do want to make sure that we are getting all the composers in the UK who want to apply to us, basically. So yeah.
In this week's stage, I saw an initiative for writers, and whether writers extends to composers, lyricists and librettists as well as writers, bearing in mind that less people are writing during lockdown or are being drained to television and film and whatever. And definitely it was proportionally broken down to support global majority writers and women writing and trying to redress balances. So if you grab this week's stage and have a look, but I can't remember exactly what it said and what the fund was, but it's probably worth a look, but it's on the front page.
For producers, would stage one have a Bridge the Gap program?
They do. Yeah. That's right. Yes.
Yeah, there's a lot of initiatives, and MMD and MTN are currently partnering with China Plate and Royal and Derngate and Birmingham Hippodrome on a musical theatre darkroom initiative, which, while it's not funding, it is a funded opportunity, a residential placement that's specifically for musical theatre writers from the global majority. I think there are lots of as everyone's saying, lots of particular initiatives that are proactive in helping support the diversification of the sector. Over to Emily for the next question.
Thank you. So we've got a question from Ruth about if a team are creating a musical that's particularly for overseas markets, possibly thinking about Korea, China, how could they come to PRS John Lyons? Perhaps we put Arts Council in this as well, for support for those musicals. How much would they have to balance it's made in the UK but it's touring, or it's all going to be for overseas markets? Does anyone have a sense of being able to support that?
It is a question.
Yeah, an answer to that question.
I think it can be, it's about how the project is formed, really. Like if you were writing it and it has a UK premiere, then because PRS Foundation supports music creators who are based in the UK, and for our Open Fund and Women Make Music, it's for projects that mainly happen in the UK. Like if there was like one performance in Paris or something, that can be applied for. But if it was a whole European or world tour, then there would need to be a UK premiere. And so it's kind of like thinking again about which funders you're applying for these opportunities. So you could come to PRS Foundation for the UK premiere, and then when you want to tour it, that goes somewhere else.
And don't get too stuck thinking that trusts and foundations are your only option for fundraising. As Neil said, there's lots of different ways you can slice up the cake, and you can break your project down into, just as Elizabeth said, into different chunks to be funded, and you might use different tools for those different chunks.
Great, thank you.
Sorry, Emily. One thing we've not talked about yet is crowdfunding. That occasionally, I know, well, Neil mentioned it before about American Psycho, I forgot. I was just wondering, if people are crowdfunding, how does that sit alongside an application to a trust and foundation, or to the Arts Council indeed? I mean, have anyone had examples of this where, because crowdfunding, the level of income that's going to come through that avenue is often quite unknown when people might be writing an application? Any advice on how people might position a crowdfunding income stream alongside the wider budget projections of box office income and so on?
It's really difficult to say with crowdfunding, because, like, obviously, as Neil was saying earlier, like American Psycho did have a lot of backing behind it. I'm not going to talk about musical theatre in specific, but it's hard. Like, we would never give a conditional offer on the fact that you would reach your crowdfunding target, because that's probably very stressful for the music creator involved. I would, look at your budget really detailed and look at the trusts and foundations that you can apply for, and what the box office income is and everything else involved, and then what that shortfall is in terms of crowdfunding, so it is, quite realistic, and what you have to offer for the fans of your work. I wouldn't want you to see there's a shortfall of a large sum of money and then have to make this up with crowdfunding, because it might be that the crowdfunding is for, like, as I said, like a different element of the project when the kind of all the development of it is done. So the work, then maybe the crowdfunding comes into it, really.
Yeah, I think it's about being realistic. So I have put it in applications, but it's where we've said, look, this amount is confirmed. There's a shortfall of 4,000, which we expect to be made up of 25% sponsorship, 25% local authority, 25% crowdfunding, and 25% philanthropic supporters or something, and giving a bit of explanation around that and who they might be. So it might be that we don't hit that, but the other one can compensate. But it can't be significant amounts because, as you say, it's an unknown variable.
Great, thank you. So any thoughts when it comes to recording a cast album? And obviously there was a lot more of that kind of work going on during lockdown, of people kind of, being able to get their work recorded, getting it down, having it ready. Do you think, or maybe this is a Neil question because I know you've done it in the past, do you think it is possible to get funding just purely for the cast recording, and then you might go on and get funding for full production later? But where might you turn for a cast album recording?
I mean, modern technology makes it much easier if you've got a production on, because you can just plug into the sound desk. What you do need is the permission of every creative and artist involved, and they may all expect some kind of remuneration appropriately for doing that. So it's not as simple as just recording it. I mean, there is a cost to recording a cast album, which can be a few thousand to a few $100,000. And it depends how you distribute it. But the important thing is, again, to get everyone's buy-in. With the new work, it might be more straightforward because the mechanical rights are less complex than if a publisher's involved as well. But it's all about getting permissions. I've never applied for a cast album first. I know there's the way of doing a show first, like Jesus Christ Superstar or Six or stuff where you do almost an arena performance that leads on to the next stage. And you might do, so we did do Soho Cinders in concert in the West End for one night only and recorded it. And then we had a CD to release. But the money was for the production, and then the CD came off it. We didn't apply for a CD.
That's great. And we've got a very broad question here from Jonathan that's to the whole industry, so we can be representatives of the industry for a moment. And that's asking, in terms of the current crisis in Ukraine, how might the industry support musical makers from the Ukraine? Are there funding opportunities for those of us in the UK industry to help refugee artists who might find themselves in the UK? And similarly, with are there things we can do to support with travel and subsistence towards platforming Ukrainian musicals here? It's a nice, generous thought. Has anyone got any thoughts on that? It's a big question, isn't it? It's not one I've come across before. And I think we are all, as an industry and as a society, looking at ways that we can support and can whatever can be done. I think there will be many further fundraising. We're already seeing there was a ballet gala just the other night at the Colosseum in London, and I imagine that there may well, I think someone was talking about there was a musical theatre concert being staged. It was somewhere outside of London in the UK. That was a selection of musical theatre songs that was being held as a benefit to Ukrainian people generally. I've not heard of anything so far that is specifically to support Ukrainian musical theatre artists. It's a good question to research, what's happening in new musical theatre writing in the Ukraine, or what was happening, and are there peers that we could reach out to support? It's a lovely idea.
For sure. I mean, as you say, I've seen benefits to support individuals and official charities set up to try and distribute those funds. But the flip side's interesting, but a bit more complex for sure.
And I think if you're listening live, we're probably sort of moving towards the end. So if you've got a question that you've been thinking, oh, I really want to ask our panelists this question, this is your last opportunity to send something through right now. Any final questions that haven't already been asked? I think over to Emily, she's got one to pass on.
Yes. So again, quite a broad industry question about how we might as an industry be supporting UK musicals being turned into films. We know this happens with, for the example that's come through is In the Heights, very, very renowned, well-established musical then becoming a film. I suppose on a scale in the UK, is there anything that funders are particularly supporting, or producers that are particularly looking at that move from the stage to film or TV, in fact? I think that's something Neil's quite interested in. Is that right?
It is. I mean, disappointingly, and I hope I'm not talking out of tune, and I hope it wasn't just to fob me off, but I got through to the senior people at Netflix who said that musical theatre in the UK wasn't a priority for them at the moment. If that is the case, that's a shame. That's not to say there aren't a lot of other commissioning bodies out there, and certainly everything from Tick Tick Boom to Fly to the Conchords to My Crazy Ex-Girlfriend to The Eddie. There are lots of exemplars of musical theatre on television and of course in film, but commissioners in television and film are well protected and well hidden, and it's quite hard to find the decision makers. But I do feel it's a brave new world that the musical theatre community have a great deal to offer to.
Lovely, thank you. Yes, I think as I know, there'll be people out there listening and watching this who are creators of wonderful new musicals, and just keep going, get them on, and if there's success on the stage, then there's always that potential and that possibility. Great. I think James might have a question. Is that right?
I don't think so. I haven't got any further questions. I was just got from the chat, our lovely Kate McKeown, who's our sort of backstage coordinator with these calls, was passing on that in terms of Ukrainian, to follow up on that question, Ukrainian musicals, there's Counting Sheep, an immersive folk musical, which is an incredible show by a Ukrainian company. And in recent years at the Volts Festival, Belka Productions supported a musical or a show at least, by a Ukrainian company called Likely Story. So of course there is musical theatre in the Ukraine, and bound to be musical theatre artists out there. So that's everyone's sort of takeaway homework exercise. Go and research some musical theatre artists and look at ways that we can reach out to them. It may even be just messaging. There may still be ways to send through various platforms to send words of support, which means so much in these times. It looks like we've got one last question that Emily has.
Just to say, Leonard Bernstein's family were from the Ukraine.
Wow, and I think he wrote a musical, didn't he? One or two, few
well-known ones somewhere. Yeah.
I think one was turned into a couple of films.
That's right.
Oh, I must look into that. Oh, I think Emily's breaking up slightly. We'll try again.
So I think possibly our final question comes from Laurel, and it's about being part of a team writing musicals. So if you've got a group of writers writing a musical, okay, so if there's a group of writers writing a musical together, and then potentially a composer or more than one composer, how do we make sure we've dealt with and are supporting everyone's intellectual property? Now, I'm just going to start an answer to this, because at MMD we have a service which is one of our board is a legal expert around IP, around collaborative agreements, writing new shows, and all of this area. So MMD members are very lucky to be able to get free advice sessions from Stephen, and this is absolutely his territory. So that's one way of answering this question. But over to the panel, any thoughts or advice around IP?
I think the important thing is to set up a collaboration agreement between the creatives, something they're all happy with right at the beginning. Because, I've done a few shows that have had lots and lots.
I hope you were able to hear that. Could you hear it, James?
I was saying I've done a few shows where there have been lots of collaborators involved. And the important thing is to have a collaboration agreement between everyone involved and set out the terms. So if there are 12 people, maybe you split it 12 ways, or you figure out that if there is any commercial revenue in the future, how do you legislate for that? Or if it's 12 composers but one book writer, what's the book writer's share? But you want to hammer all this stuff out before the show goes on, because otherwise you have troubles down the line. Famously, a chorus line, which is a verbatim piece, was essentially the testimony of a lot of people that sat in a room. And for years and years, none of them benefited. And ultimately, they were given a payment way down the line. But it's a question of coming up with an agreement at the beginning.
Thank you. Any further thoughts on intellectual property? We'll leave it to the legal specialists. Yeah, I always get myself into knots if I start to tell people answers to legal questions and then think I'm out of my depth here. And it's a reminder to us all, isn't it, to always feel free to say, I think you need to ask the specialist in this area. But thank you so much to our specialists tonight. Before we finish up, a note from Kate. Counting Sheep was the show at the Vaults, and it was not by Likely Story. Sorry, that was me misreading the notes in the chat from Kate, that the show that was by a Ukrainian company was called Counting Sheep, and that was at the Vaults Festival in the past. So do look up and Google and find out about the company Likely Story, who put on a musical from the Ukraine called Counting Sheep. That's your homework assignment. It's just to say that don't forget, we have now put tickets on sale for the UK Musical Theatre Conference. It's on the 16th of May at Birmingham Hippodrome, and tickets are now on sale. If if you're a member of MMD or MTN, you should have emails in your inbox with booking links there. We would love you to join us. It's great to hopefully have the opportunity to gather in person to talk about some of the subjects that we've touched upon tonight in this discussion, but also looking at how the art form of musical theatre is evolving. So do join us there. But now to thank our wonderful panelists, Elizabeth Sills from PRS Foundation, Fiona Mallin-Robinson from the John Lyon charity and fundraising consultant, Neil Marcus, producer and fundraiser extraordinaire, and also to thank Emily Gray, who I believe this is Emily's final member event while executive director of MMD, possibly, unless there are any more in the next little month. But thank you so much, Emily, for all your wonderful co-hosting in these events.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for this lovely panel. Just demystifying things around fundraising is so important. I know that from my own experience of it, but also working with so many members on how to get that funding. So I think my internet connection has been so terrible tonight. I do apologise for that. But a big thank you from me to the panel and to everybody watching. And perhaps I'm saying good night, but maybe you can't quite hear me. But thank you, everybody, and goodbye.